Kids who ran away, what's your story? Serious. It was 3 weeks before my 18th birthday and I ran away to my older sister's house out of state. My mom was extremely abusive, physical and emotional, and told me that as soon as I turned 18 she was going to burn all my belongings. She made sure mention my driver's license, birth certificate, and social security card, and kick me out into the streets. She already stole all my money, since I wasn't legally old enough to have my own bank account, every month when I got paid, so I knew if she burned all my belongings I'd be ruined. I ran away while she went on vacation and took what belongings I could fit into my friend's car. I cashed out what money I had left in my account, less than $400, and hid at my sister's place in the meantime. My mom lied to the police and told them I was 16 years old, a drug addict, suicidal, and that I ran away with my 32-year-old boyfriend who was an armed drug dealer. The police found me 4 days before my birthday and tackled me to the asphalt, assuming I was armed. They were very angry when they booked me and found out I was almost 18 and clearly not on drugs or with any old man. Legally they had to send me back to live with my mother, so I stayed in custody for 3 days and was about to be transported back to her, but thankfully turned 18 before that happened. Turns out all the belongings I left behind were indeed burned, and my driver's license was suspended, since parents can legally do that to minors. Thank God I managed to save all the important things before she got her hands on them. I'm now 27, married, and pregnant. I went to so much therapy to work through all the trauma I experienced as a child and luckily managed to create a happy and successful life for myself. I haven't spoke to her since I ran away. I've seen her randomly over the years, like at my grandma's funeral, my little sister's high school play, and when I helped that same little sister move out of that awful house when she turned 18. I don't plan on including her in my life, ever. 16 years old. Lived with my dad, and after years of emotional abuse, he snapped and grabbed me by the throat. I can't remember much more. On autopilot, I took my wallet, phone, and charger and just left. I didn't really have an idea of where to go, so I felt my best chances were going to the train station and see from there on. I got a response from a friend in another city where I could stay and wanted to leave town since I was scared and had the feeling the police were searching for me. They were. I had like 40 euros and to save money I decided to walk instead of taking the bus. Maybe the most movie moment out of my life is walking a long straight road with water next to it. We just have had a few hot summer days, and while the sun was going down, thunderstorms rolled in. Adrenaline worn off, and I realized I had pain and was limping. Headache, dizzy, but also an overwhelming feeling of liberation. It started to rain, and I realized my fuck up for not taking my coat. I only wore a t-shirt, and it was getting cold. In the distance, I saw a bus stop with one person waiting. But the last bus hasn't left yet. I must have looked like crap, cause the guy, like 40 years, waiting there started talking to me. I told him what happened, and he said he already felt weird energy around me. He offered a place to sleep, but I refused, cause year-old guy, teenage girl, it felt weird. I refused and he understood. We smoked pot together. He paid for my bus ticket and exchanged numbers. I always regretted not taking the offer, but that's another story. The next day we hang out, and he bought food for me. I decided to contact friends who were worried and promised them to come back. This story will always stay with me. It kickstarted major changes in my life, still affecting me today. I stood up for myself. Edit. Lots of mistakes. 2 stories. The fateful can opener. Oink oink. Cunt. 1. I ran away when I was 13 because I didn't want to go to my dad's. I stuffed a backpack full of canned food and some books. I get to my spot in this forest area under the bridge and hide. The police came looking for me around there, but I hid from their flashlights in a bush. Later that night I went to grab some of the canned food I brought, just to find out I forgot the can opener. Mission failed. I was starving, so I concocted this plan to sneak into my house, to grab it and leave, but there was a search party looking for me, and so the cops picked me up on the highway less than a mile from my house. 2. Another time, about 4 years later, I was dating a girl that my mom absolutely despised. I took off without her knowing in an attempt to run away with a girlfriend. We went to her older sister's house on a farm kind of thing in the country. Damn pigs got me arrested. Literally. There was a search party looking for me yet again, and they actually came to the house I was at twice, but the sister and her parents covered for us saying we weren't there. Well, a while later I went out back to smoke and saw a state trooper car pull up in the driveway. I ran down the hill and hid on the side of the barn. The thing is, there were like 20 cows and pigs behind a fence just 15 feet or so from me. It was snowing heavy, so I figured that'd block the officer's view. Nope. He comes out back and just stares at the barn I'm hiding next to. I'm pretty sure he would have walked away too if it weren't for those faking pigs deciding to all line up by the fence and directly face me and start making loud pig noises. The officer picked up on that and came down to discover me. I was 17, so he actually put me under arrest. Everything was fine though, and I learned my lesson until about a year later when I did something similar with a new girlfriend, but being 18, it was just incredibly stupid and backfired on the both us immensely. When I was in high school I lived with my dad after I moved from where I grew up because my mom wanted to move. My mom lived about an hour's drive away. This is relevant later. My dad started dating this woman who was extremely abusive. Unfortunately, he and I are a lot alike in the way that we both are easily manipulated. Her and I got into a fight one night because she accused me of telling everything that was going on to my mom, whom I hadn't spoken to in months due to drugs. She slapped me across the face hard enough that her faker's nails actually cut me as well. I pushed her over the coffee table and walked out. It was about midnight, so I didn't want to bother my friends. I walked about 4 miles before I got to the overpass of the interstate where I stopped to sleep a bit. The next day, I walked the rest of the way to my mom's house, which took about 10 hours. When I got to my mom's house, she was strung out, so I just turned around and left. I walked the 5 hours to Walmart and hung out for another 6 or 7 hours, and then I guess someone at Walmart had spoken to the cops that had stopped in, and they stopped to talk to me. When they got my name and called it in, apparently my dad had told his friend who was an officer that happened to be called by the neighbors following the fight the night before. So they asked about the cuts on my face, and I told them, and they asked if I wanted to press charges. I said no, because I didn't want my dad to be mad at me. They took me back, and it turns out that my dad kicked her out of the house immediately after I left, and he spent the whole night trying to find me himself. It made me proud of him, because the first time he actually showed some backbone in a relationship was because of me. I had almost run away when I was about 8 or 9. My cousin was an abusive jerk back then and leeched off my mom. He physically and mentally abused us so much that I can't listen to someone slightly raising their voice without tearing up. At that time, they were having a screaming match, and I had recently got a knife collection. I sat in the locked room and was stabbing the wall with hatred. I ran out of the basement, where our room was, and ran over to my nice neighbor's house. I went to the back door, knocked and waited. When she answered I was so happy, because I just wanted to stop hearing the screaming. My cousin is now a father and visits often, and is kind and well-tempered. His wife cheated on him, and he now has to pay CS. I still suspect he killed my cat as some vendetta against my brother who owned it, and was a pedo. Edit. My brother was found with a big CP on his computer, and I'm not certain that my cousin killed him. It's just because my cat went missing suddenly, and my brother didn't know where he went either, and my brother loved my cat, so after that he went downhill. He has Asperger's and showed little to no sadness when he passed, but I knew he became distant and sat in his room for days at a time. That's all I know, because my mom doesn't know either. Sorry for commas, and my other comments on my account explain my childhood a bit more. Never mind, literally forgot about this post, damn. I tried to run when I was 11-12 years old. I was being infantilized by one parent, forced to grow up too fast by the other, and going through emotional abuse every single day that was enabled. I was neglected to the point that I had to live off of my best friend's lunches, junk food that I found and hid in my bedroom, and fast food. One of my parents was a genuine narcissistic sociopath. I've been online from a very young age and really didn't have as much supervision as I should have had. I was planning to run away with someone I had been talking to for years. They were actually a catfish much older than me, and in my heart, I think I knew that it was too good to be true, but I was so ready to just leave everything behind that I didn't care. I just needed a reason to get out of my house, since I didn't have the guts to kill myself. My running away was planned down to the nearest detail. I didn't skimp on anything. I spent over 6 months planning my escape. I knew all the harsh realities of running away homelessness, literally needing to fend for yourself, and I fully accepted them. I don't think I understood just how many bad people there were out there, and I literally thought that human trafficking was people getting hit by cars, but once again, it was all worth it for a new life. I researched how to steal things so that I would have enough to eat, should I ever need it, and how to live on the streets. I thought about how I would keep warm in the blistering winters and keep cool in the sweltering heat. I took note of places I could stay. I stole a small amount of money off my parents' dresser to top up what I already had of my own. I was going to completely change my appearance, go by a completely different name, and I practiced being that person for around an hour almost every single night. I've never had to sleep all that much, so planned to use that to my advantage and make my way to another part of Canada overnight, whether that was on foot, by bus, by train, whatever it took. I even got a little ahead of myself and thought maybe I could smuggle myself into the United States, or, somehow, without a passport, take a plane to England. The further away I was from home, the better. I was ready to leave everything and everyone behind. I had only the bare essentials on my back. I never made it all that far. I had slipped out of the house multiple times to try my hand at yet another escape, and no one knew. And something in me always made me go back. If I had succeeded, it would have literally been a case of here today, gone tomorrow. No one ever suspected I might never be in their lives again. As an adult now, a small part of me wishes I would have completely gone through with it. Things have gotten better, but only to a point. I'm a mentally ill wreck with struggles I'll literally never overcome, and I know part of it has to do with the fact that I had to grow up in that shit-show. I'm not as naive as I was, obviously. The dangers of the world are much greater than 11-12-year-old me could ever know or understand. Human trafficking is not people getting hit by cars, and I don't think anyone is truly prepared to be homeless. I'd still do it. I don't feel anything when I look back at this point in my life. Like most of my childhood, I prefer to just sort of forget about it and pretend that it was normal. I would be sad today if I left everything and everyone behind, but it sounds horrible, but I feel like it would be worth it. I just wanted and want a second chance at the life I never got. I wish I was someone else with someone else's life. Happened when I was 16. My mother was abusive for so many years. I'd had a terrible few weeks. A friend of mine had died in a car crash. Another friend had been diagnosed with cancer and was going to lose his leg. And I'd been dealing with my parents arguing every day, the police being called to our house nightly, and the pressure of upcoming exams. One night I was home alone with my mum, and I had come downstairs to get some water because I had a headache from crying. My mum stood at the bottom of the stairs and told me that she hoped my friend with cancer would die during the operation. So after years of just putting up with her abuse, I snapped a little and started punching and kicking at her chest, me being a few steps up from her. Obviously this was a bad idea on my part. I got beaten quite badly. Mum then went out. I don't really remember what happened immediately after, but I remember that an hour or so later I was sat on my bed knitting with blood running down my face and arms onto the yarn. It's a weird thing to remember. I'm pretty sure I was quite deeply in shock and my mind had just decided to pretend nothing was wrong for a while. Anyway, after this my sister had come home and had taken me to my aunt's house, where they took pictures of all the injuries in case I wanted to go to the police. I stayed there for a night, but felt like a nuisance, so the next night I told them that I was going to stay with a friend. Instead I went down to a local park and stayed there at night in a shelter. Looked kind of like a bus shelter with a bench. At night I sat up awake, paced a lot to keep warm. I felt very vulnerable there in the dark alone. Every morning I'd go after school and then go back to the park. I wore makeup to mask my black eyes and told my teachers I'd had an accident in taekwondo and wore long sleeves to hide the bruises and scratches. After school I'd nap in a sunny spot in the park. Honestly, it was peaceful there. I felt safer in the park than I had at home in years. I also had 2 sleepovers with friends during this week. I didn't tell them I was sleeping rough. I hadn't even told them about my home life. So yeah, after 5 nights at the park and 2 nights at friends' houses I was told my mum had left and moved somewhere else. I came back home and I didn't tell anyone that I hadn't been staying at friends' houses for all of that week. My dad never acknowledged what happened and continued to fight for the marriage for a while. I don't blame him though. I have to remember that he had been the victim of domestic abuse from my mother for years at that point. All in all, it was cold and scary and so tiring, but I found it to be peaceful and so much better than being at home while my mum was there. It was about 2 months after my 17th birthday. I was living at my dad's and his girlfriend at the time. Ever since I moved to his place we had little fights, almost daily. Didn't bother me one bit. I guess I was used to it. One day it got out of hand though. Me and his girlfriend were having a fight, and when I said something along the lines of "I now understand why your own son didn't even want to live with you," which obviously crossed a line. Her son used to live with us until he moved to his dad at around 14. She then spilled a literal boiling cup of coffee into my face. I almost lost it and wanted to hit her, but I saw my father's face. He was cool with everything. He probably thought she was right throwing that sheet into my face. I just wiped it off and left the apartment to go to my place. I had my own apartment in the house my dad lived in, 2 stories above his apartment. I grabbed my phone and a backpack, calling my grandmother while putting everything that I needed and could carry into my backpack. My grandmother heard me out and immediately said I could come to her and stay there. I left the same hour with no intentions of coming back. About 2 days later I got a SMS from my dad asking me where I am. 2 days later? I told him, and he said I had a week to get all my stuff. So I called up my 3 best friends from school and we took everything that we could fit inside of moving boxes and sent it to my grandparents with a taxi. I then threw my keys into the mailbox of my dad and left. 2 weeks after that my savings account, where I had saved about €4,000 since I was 12, was completely wiped. Talked to my dad about 2 or 3 times after that to get my mail and haven't made any effort to see/talk to him since. That was 4 years ago. I still live with my grandparents, and besides struggling with addiction and money problems, everything is wonderful. My mom is a narcissist of the worst kind. Managed to get full custody and drive my dad away for good. My older sister and I became really close because she made our lives hell. 8 years of lies and manipulation and emotional whiplash from her. I always wanted to get out but never could figure out a way how because she had me so trapped under her thumb. When I started work in the food industry, I befriended a manager, Nina, in her early 20s. We initially bonded over our shared experiences with being gay around homophobic relatives, but eventually I told her about the abuse I lived through at home. She began to encourage me to get out because the abuse was just getting worse. She offered me a room in her house and said she wouldn't expect me to pay rent for a while. She just wanted me safely away from my mom's abuse. From December 2018 until May 2019, Nina and I planned out finances, how I would still attend college, get a car, etc. Nina got me a bed for my room, a desk, a bookshelf, little knickknacks, and helped me little by little sneak my belongings from my mom's house into hers. We set the runaway day to be the night I graduated high school, because then it would be in public, so my mom couldn't try to hurt me, and I would legally be free to go by then. My plans to run away gradually became known among the management team at my store as graduation drew nearer. We even got my sister a burner phone for the night of graduation after I took off, in case my mom tried to take away her phone and she needed to contact me or the police if my mom got violent. When graduation concluded, I walked out of the ceremony to the parking lot. I faked like I was going to the passenger side of the car so that Nina, who I'd planned to be at my side, could come out of the crowd of exiting graduates and join me. I then doubled around to the driver's side, where my mom was getting in. I told her I wasn't coming home with her. She turned around, saw Nina and she started freaking out once she put two and two together. I'll admit that I exploded on her, drawing the attention of some of the people leaving the graduation ceremony. She got furious at this, because she's very concerned with her image in front of other people. She seemed more angry about the fact that I was humiliating her in public, rather than the fact that I was running off on her. She tried to incorporate Nina and my sister in the argument. She kept saying that she never abused me, and I was lying. I realized I couldn't make her understand her wrongdoing. So Nina and I took off across the parking lot and left. I spent the night of high school graduation in a house I hadn't lived in, before crying my eyes out and trying to process everything that had happened. In the 3 months that followed my departure from home, my mom used my sister, who still lived at home, to try and guilt trip me into coming back. My mom even came by my workplace a few times to try and catch me off guard. She threatened to call the cops on Nina, promised that she would have her followed, have her fired, get a restraining order on her, and told my entire family that I had been brainwashed and kidnapped by an older woman. She went to the operator of the store Nina and I work at and tried to convince him of why Nina should be fired. My mom would blow up my phone with incredibly long texts about how ungrateful I was for all she did for me and how I needed to forgive her because she was sorry. When I came out to as gay her after running away, she told my whole family that my kidnapper had turned me into a lesbian. So I blocked her on social media and blocked her number, effectively cutting her off again, completely this time. She has no way of contacting me. As of the time I'm posting this, it's been 4 months since I ran away, 3 months since I started talking to her after running away, and 2 weeks since I cut her off completely again. It's been the hardest 6 months of my life. Hold on to the people who help you, and hold on to the knowledge that you deserve to not be trapped. It's hard going from a cage to wide open space, because it feels like falling. But freedom is worth fighting for. I ran away at 16 because CPS refused to help me. My parents divorced when I was 10. I was going to live with my mom and visit my father for the summer. Mom was in Indiana, father was in Florida. After we got to my dad's house, he started pressing me and my 3 brothers. He kept asking if we were molested and asked over and over for about 10 minutes. Finally my brother said okay, fine. We were molested, and the rest of us followed his lead. We just wanted to be left alone, and it was kind of an awkward conversation. Keep in mind, nothing had actually happened. After that, my father took us all to see a therapist or something, and told us to repeat what was said. He kind of went over our story before to make it more believable. The lie kept getting bigger, so me and the older brother tried telling him that it wasn't actually true, but we were threatened with things like yes it did happen. If you ever say it didn't, I'll see to it that you never walk again. Over the next 6 years, his abuse kept getting worse. I had no contact with my mom, and he was constantly shit-talking her. I had a suicide attempt at 16 and was put in a mental facility for 3 days. I talked with CPS and told them everything and that I wanted to live with my mother. They were very sympathetic and agreed to do everything in their power for me. My last day in the facility, they sat me down and told me yeah, we looked into your situation. With your dad having full custody and your mother in another state, it's just too much work for us, and it's best if we let the situation resolve itself. Then sent my back to my father. It got to the point where I knew I couldn't stay there, so I found my mom on Facebook and told her everything. She bought me a bus ticket from Florida to Indiana, and I left home at 4:30 a.m. There was a time where I thought I'd been caught. I was stopped in Orlando, and an officer approached me and started asking me questions. Where are you going? What's your name? That sort of thing. He said he just noticed I've been there for a while and wanted to check up me, and I told him how I missed my bus. It was actually full, but an 8-hour wait for the next one, and he left me alone. The rest of the trip went as smoothly as a 24-hour bus ride can. It took my father a week to realize I was gone, and I had to hide from police for another week. Then there was an emergency custody hearing and well, him saying I left 7 days after I just didn't look well for him. So, my mom got custody, and when I told her nothing had happened when we were 10, she was convinced it was the truth. She got to work on getting custody of my younger brothers. My father no longer has custody of any of us, and I haven't seen him in years. My mom did consider a lawsuit with CPS, but didn't go through with it. I was actually 19, but I was still very much a child, to be honest. I was struggling a lot with mental health problems, and my dad, who I was living with at the time, was not very understanding. I also had a wrong diagnosis, which is why I was put on antidepressants, which later on turned out to have triggered an episode of mania, which is part of the reason I ran away without thinking about it after I had a bad fight with my dad. First I ended up at a shelter, but the staff here was very shitty, to say the least. They had zero understanding for my mental health issues, were homophobic and sexist, and they even got mad at me when I was suicidal. After a month I moved in with a friend in England, and I lived here for 3 months. This was actually a really great time, but since he was still a student and I wasn't actually allowed to live there, I got deported, which sounds much worse than it was. Basically the city council paid for my ticket back home. When I returned to my own country I had nowhere to go. People who I thought were friends didn't have time for me, they said, and some even got mad at me because I hadn't spoken to them for months. I remember being at a shelter where they literally said they couldn't help me, and one of them even sounded annoyed that I had asked them for help. I went to the bathroom and cried, feeling so hopeless. The shelter I had been to previously didn't want to take me back because I left by my own choice. Luckily I still managed to get to a shelter that would take me in. This shelter was one where you could stay the night, but you had to be outside from 8 o'clock to 2000 hours. It was extremely cold out. I had to take all my things with me every time, and all I got to eat was 2 sandwiches. I had no money, and all the other homeless people were old men who were constantly drunk. They were nice to me, but they weren't exactly friends either. I remember sitting in front of a supermarket with a blanket around me because I could get Wi-Fi there for 3 hours a day, and I wanted to talk to my only friend, the one in England. I was clearly a homeless teenager. People stared at me, some in disdain, most of them feeling powerless and confused. Not a single person offered me food, help, or anything. The only person that ever came up to me was a man who suggested I'd sit elsewhere so people couldn't see me. I was honestly so lost and scared. About a week later I got accepted into a youth shelter in another town. I still had to pay my own train tickets, even though I didn't have money. I don't remember how I got there, to be honest. A lot of this is super fuzzy to me. In the youth shelter I only had to be outside from 9 o'clock till 1500 hours. Still a long time when it's cold and you have nothing to do, but way more bearable. I still only got dry bread to eat in the morning, which was honestly so disgusting I usually didn't even eat it. It's funny how, when you're hungry, you have a hard time eating. I got to work at a daycare center, but the people were extremely homophobic and just overall mean, and I always got a headache when I was there. I did get paid a little bit for it, but not enough to buy food. No one seemed to care I didn't have food. In the meantime I had to pay for every single night I stayed there, but because I couldn't I was already in debt, which obviously doesn't help. When some of the staff at the daycare released sensitive personal information about me to other homeless people, a lot of them being dangerous criminals, I quit there. The next bit is honestly a big blur for me. I stayed there for about a year. Getting out of a situation like that is extremely hard, especially when you're suffering from severe mental illness. I'm not sure how and when it all happened, but I learned to steal from the other homeless people. First I would steal food, later on I got into some kind of frenzy state, and I was just stealing every single thing I found in stores every day, and to this day I still have so many useless things in my home to the extent I can't store them all, even though I've thrown out so much. I only got arrested once. Remember that I was very manic at this time, so in my head this all seemed like a good idea, even though normally I'd never do this. In desperate need of money, I eventually resorted to prostitution. You should know I had never had sex before until this point, so it has shaped the way I feel about sex a lot. It was just an overall bad experience. None of my clients have ever been mean, forceful, or violent with me, but it's still by no means a safe place for someone who isn't confident in what they do. especially considering I did it out of desperation, and because of my mental illness. The experience was rather traumatizing. It was through this that I came into contact with a pimp who sexually abused me the second time we met. I never saw him again after that. By that time I was so manic and depressed at the same time. I wanted to die. I wanted to try drugs, and I wanted to manipulate the other homeless people into beating the crap out of that pimp. The people in there by then had accepted me as one of their own and were very protective over me. They beat the shit out of someone who had been harassing and threatening me for weeks. They were very mean at first though, but to this day I really respect them. I think I have gotten over my social anxiety because of them. I was admitted to a mental hospital after I threatened to kill myself multiple times. It was a forced admission and my stay there was terrible. The staff and patients were homophobic and mean, some even violent. There was one patient who was a full-blown sociopath, the kind you see in movies. Even the very buff guys there were scared of him, even when he only spoke. The way he spoke to you sent chills down your spine, trust me. But I was too manic to realize this. I felt like I could defeat the world, but I was very unhappy. This guy grabbed my butt out of nowhere, even though he was straight. I'm a very feminine guy, and after I reported it to the staff he tried to kick down my door and wanted to kill me. If it weren't for the police he would have done it too. They had to kick him out of there with 6 armed police officers, and we were locked in the living room with the emergency exit open. We had to be ready to run. I ran into this same guy a year later when we were both out next to my house, and although nothing happened that really scared me. Back then I wasn't scared at all though. Not one bit. Blame the mania for that. Luckily after this, I managed to work things out with my parents a little. I moved back with my dad for a while, then moved back into the shelter, and after that I finally got a house. It's not until now, 3 years later, that I'm finally starting to get back on my feet. I'm now a starting freelance artist, and I'm setting up a web shop. Just today I finally got the keys to my new workplace. I'm still struggling a lot. I got sexually abused again, and during one manic episode I got back into prostitution, etc etc. But for the first time in my life I feel like things are starting to look better, and not out of some false sense of confidence triggered by my mental illness. I'm not there yet, but getting there. I was 17 at the time. I was with my ex-fiancée, GF at the time, and I got really sick one week. I have a nicotine addiction, and if I go without it for over 8 hours I start getting cranky, and the longer I'll get pissed at everything. So when I was sick I couldn't vape or smoke, or do anything street the time, and went without it for 4 days straight. The last day I was sick I was already 4 days in without nicotine, and my mom was yelling street me and getting pissy with me about something. It wasn't much, just something small, but I went off because of how pissy I was. I got so pissed that I packed some clothes and other stuff and called my GF to come pick me up. My GF knew about all that was going down, so they were ready. I went to my GF's house and lived with them for a week. In my state, if a teen above the age of 17 wasn't sick anymore and had nicotine in my system, so I was feeling normal. After my mom sent me this really sad song about loving your children or something, I broke down crying and decided to go back home. Not much of a story compared to others, but still makes me sad when I think about it and how it made my mother feel. My story might only half fit here, I'm not sure. My mother was always difficult, but she had done a great job at making me her counselor, her best friend and her punching bag, physically and emotionally. After my father left her, everything escalated. There was not a single day when she wouldn't scream at me or chase me through the house if I didn't comply to whatever headcanon she assumed was obvious this time. At 15, I ran away to my boyfriend. She knew about this, so I don't know if it counts, but I cut ties with her during that time. The boyfriend was abusive, and, since I had nowhere to go, I lived like that for 8 months, before I finally couldn't take it anymore. I ran to a new guy. Yes, I know, shut up, it's complicated and I'm just not including the backstory of how that came to be, to keep the post shorter. He was abusive too. I went to the mental hospital with my mother's help, and after that return home. The beatings had stopped, but not the rest. At age 17, I moved to the capital pretty much overnight. She was aware of this one too, since it was to go to an evening school there. I cut my ties for good a year ago, after everything got bad and worse, and I'm only at the beginning of processing the things she did to me. She always said me running away at 15 was an act of puberty and defiance, but it wasn't. I just couldn't take any more screaming and hitting. She threw a knife at me once and barely missed. Not much, but blood did happen. That is just one example of how far she would take it. I was 15, and not under the impression of being ready to live on my own, or with a boyfriend for that matter. The fact that I chose that over my supposed home should probably be enough info to see that things weren't okay with her. Less running away, more being kicked out that turned into running away, kind of. I was about 8 years old. My mom was angry at me, as she often was. I had a pretty rough childhood and so she told me to pack some things and get out. I had a little Barbie backpack type thing with some clothes and a few snacks, and she just pushed me out the door and locked me outside. I started walking and kept walking for a while. I planned on going to a park a few miles away that I knew well, because I figured I could get away with sleeping there since there was shelter. I remember being scared that it would rain because I didn't have a jacket and I'd get cold very easily. I ended up circling back around to home and trying to get inside, and eventually she let me in after a few hours when she was heading off to work. I kept a backpack just in case for a long time afterwards, so that if that happened again, I'd have more of what I needed this time. I planned on never coming back that next time. I got sick and tired of my adoptive parents pointing out everything I did wrong in life and not acknowledging the things I did right. I was passing all of my classes and everything, but the one thing they wouldn't let go is the fact that I don't call them mom and dad, I call them grandma and grandpa. The person who I call mom lives in another state and she raised me. Grandpa doesn't care as much because he knows I won't call anyone else dad ever again. My dad passed away on my 13th birthday. I do my best to make them proud like hell. I'm enlisted and waiting till I graduate to go off to the army. The one thing that pissed grandma off more than anything I have ever done was when the courts asked me if I wanted to change my last name. I said no, because I'm going to be proud to have my last name on that military badge and keep my name running. The last family members I have with my last name are my deadbeat meth head dad's dad and my little brother who lives with my mom. So I said no, I'm not changing my last name, and I was proud of my decision, and so was my grandpa. But grandma freaked and muted the phone and went to grab a knife out of the kitchen and said, if you don't change it, you'll regret it. I said fuck off, I'm not changing it, and I grabbed my knife from my belt to defend myself, and she knew I'm crazy, so she unmuted the phone and agreed to the rest of what the judge said. When I got home from work after all of that, my car keys were gone and my bags were packed. She took my car that I paid for and went joyriding. I was pissed, so I called it in stolen, and she came back an hour later in cuffs and said she hated me. I got my car back, threw my bags in it, and drove to the bank to pull all my cash out before she could. Around 3 grand. I got a call that night saying if I don't come home she's gonna call me in. I stopped by home and asked what was going on and got greeted back by being punched in my nose. So I got pissed and told grandpa sorry. I walked up to my room and all I saw was a picture of my family ripped up and shattered, and my dad's urn was unscrewed with his ashes on the floor. I grabbed my gun from the safe and went downstairs to ask her why my dad was so disrespected, and grandpa unholstered his gun from his side and pointed it at me and told me to put it down. Well, grandpa didn't know what his wife did to my dad. I walked him upstairs and showed him my dad's half-empty urn. He went back downstairs, threw me the keys to his truck, and said he knew it wasn't enough to repay for mental damage like that, but hopefully it would be enough to keep me from shooting his wife, and that he would give me the title later. It's an F357.3 turbo diesel with a 10-inch lifted and 33-inch Nato mud grappler tires. I came back the next day to find her crying, and I grabbed the rest of my sheet and left. I never got emancipated. Grandpa just knows if I come back she's not safe, and I won't let anyone take my guns. I know this story isn't exactly what you'll expected, but technically I'm still running away until I turn 18. I just live with my best friend because he lives with my other good friend. It's great and I'm still passing all of my classes. I said this in another Ask Reddit, but I'll say it more detailed. I was in 6th grade, so about 5 or 6 years ago. I was 12 or 13. I was depressed because I always was getting picked on. I'd smelled but I got eye trouble a month before I ran off, so I was trying to change from that. I always had outburst over small stuff, so it all messed with me because I was trying to change, but other students made it hard for me. I never wanted to talk about it because it felt like nobody would understand me at all. I wanted to tell my parents about why I was depressed, but I didn't know how to speak my mind. So the day before I ran away talking to my ex-best friend, I told him, if I ever ran away I'll go to X location. Note, I didn't even plan on running away at all until the next day. So next day came, and I was irritated just hearing "oh you stink" and just unkind things, and the part that made it worst is my friends at the time knew I was changing, but they never defended me at all, and that just adds to my depression because I felt like nobody liked me at all. So after school I decided to ride around on my bike. I left town and went at least an hour out of town. Then I thought and realized that I should turn back, but by time I did it was 10 p.m. So I have broken my curfew and decided I'm not going home. I went to a woods that are near the beach. I just lay down backpacker's pillow. I played there crying all night because I regretted running away, and I was scared that if I go home my parents will be pissed at me. The next day a guy was walking in the woods and I freaked out and ditched my bike and ran out of the woods. I was on the road walking and then a white SUV comes by and it was an officer. He was being nice and comfortable, so I got in. We went to the police station and I was crying because I didn't know how to feel. My dad walks in and he was happy to see me and he talked to me and we went home. I've learned something that day. Don't afraid to let it out and talk to someone, because when you do something like that it does hurt people that care about you, but the only way they can help you if you decide to say what's wrong. And now that I'm 17 I've gotten a lot better because I've changed. Even when people put me down, I stop relying on friends to help me when I'm getting put down, so I just rely on myself. So now people don't bug me anymore, so now life has been great. BTW, sorry that was long. Parents fought non-stop as a kid. My dad would punch things, but otherwise never got physical. I was extremely sheltered as we didn't have TV, internet, only one cell phone that was my dad's, and we were practically at church every day as my parents volunteered for everything. At about 11 I was exposed to porn by a friend and became obsessed with it. FBTW, any chance I could get I'd be looking at porn, and soon that led to chat rooms like Omegle. I knew I was talking to older men. I would lie and say I was 16, as if that made it any better on their part. I was never molested, to be clear, just extremely hypersexual at a young age. I even did stuff with friends before 11, but I won't go into that here. Well, I never met up with any of these 20, 25-year-olds, but after several nights of my parents fighting and screaming so loudly I couldn't sleep, I decided it was time to leave. At 12 or 13 I had several bags all half packed around my room so that it didn't look like I was doing anything except leaving clothes in a bag and not unpacking from a friend's house. I'd mentioned to a few friends that I was heading south, maybe even towards Mexico, but that was just to throw everyone off as I planned to head north towards Washington. Maybe even stop in Forks where Twilight happened. At 12/13 I had an entire map outlined of where I was going from a gigantic atlas. I packed hoodies and jeans expecting those to last the longest on the road, along with some tampons and pads for good measure. My best new tennis shoes were on and anything survival based I owned was packed too. I had about $30 to my name and planned to hit my dad's wallet before leaving. I planned to find some guy online or in person to take care of me. I think I expected things to go a little like Go Ask Alice, if you've ever read it. I waited for 1 AM to be sure everyone was asleep, got dressed, threw on my backpack, and began to sob. I stood there frozen for 2 hours until I heard someone go to the bathroom. I didn't leave that night, and it was a huge regret of my life for a long time. Shit got a lot worse at home. and I nearly went no contact when I turned 18. I'm really not sure what changed after I moved out of the house, but nearly 10 years later my mom and I are very close. I even stay the night frequently at my parents' house. So this a long one and I may do this in pieces. I ran away after becoming homeless. Bear with, this makes sense later. Growing up I didn't have a dad. All I had was a drug dealing brother, 15 years older than me, who I idolized, a twin, and a mother that was both manipulative and abusive. When I was 6 my brother went to rehab, so I became the adult of the house, as mum never did anything. Years down the line of physical and emotional abuse from my mum, both my twin and I became extremely unbalanced. I attempted suicide and self-harmed. My twin became so aggressive because she had no power at home that she ended up in a psychiatric hospital and then being fostered. No one knows why I wasn't fostered too. By 15 my mum is kicking me out all the time. I would come home just for her to slam the door in my face and would sleep on the streets. This goes in for nearly a year. Thankfully a boyfriend's family tried to house me as much as possible. One day I'm in school and I text my mum saying I'm coming home tonight. She replied, telling me she never wanted me to come home again. I went AWOL and sofa surfed etc. For some unknown reason my mum called the police and registered me as a missing person. Eventually the police find me and inform me of the situation, but because I was now 16 they couldn't make me go home. I only went back to get my stuff when mum wasn't there one day, and so before I did my GCSEs, I live in Britain, is been homeless, and then got myself a flat. I didn't exactly run away, but I have left home for weeks for drama to die down. Brace yourselves, it's a long story. I was 18 at the time and helped my brother pay his school library fine so he can graduate. Costed me about $150. Despite the fact I helped him, hours later he just did me dirty. He didn't have a car at the time, so my grandfather and I would pick him up. We always told him to give us an exact time so we can go get him. This particular time, my grandfather said we had to pick my brother up at 8 p.m. We arrived at his job and we waited for hours. Brother refused to answer phone calls and texts. Until it was 11 p.m. I had enough and knocked on the building. Fellow employees answered and explained to me that my brother finished his shift hours ago and only stated to chat. This made me and my grandpa angry, since my brother never said a thing about staying later. So my brother comes out angry saying that we suck for not doing him a favor. We asked him what time. If he said 11, we would have arrived at 11. He knows this. After a dispute he attacked me in a parking lot and ran off. This caused my grandfather to panic and called my mom. This whole situation became more of a mess when my brother now says he doesn't want me at his graduation. This caused my mom to be randomly angry at me despite the fact earlier he attacked me for him staying late at the job and having us wait. To explain why mom was mad at me, it's the classic tale of the younger brother gets treated better so the oldest gets yelled at. This made me angry that I asked a friend to help me get my stuff and left town just like that. I ignored phone calls, texts, emails, and voicemails. I just had enough of my brother's behavior and was angry. He attacked me in a parking lot and now doesn't want me at his graduation. It just made me lose it. About 3 to 4 weeks it felt like paradise. I played video games, was with friends, went sightseeing, and went to the beach. Up until the final week my friends finally convinced me that I should go back home and talk things out with my mom and brother, despite the fact I didn't want to. Finally I came back with hugs and tears, both apologizing. My brother explained that he was just overreacting and regretted what he did. He paid me back with the money I gave him, and my mom spoke to me how the things that happened wasn't my fault. I get that this story exactly isn't a runaway story, but I left not knowing when I would come back, and even lost job interviews over this situation. Not my story, but the story of my best friend in high school. This was in the 10th grade. We met at the school's orientation, and were pretty much best friends from that moment on. She lived with her dad, who was abusive in every way. The thing that finally made her run away was him grabbing her by the throat, pushing her against a wall, and saying I want to fucking kill you right now. I don't know exactly how it played out from there, but shortly afterwards she arrived at my door. She lived with my dad, and I for a few months. Attempted suicide over the Christmas break, right around New Year's. I remember hearing her throwing up after taking pretty much every pill she could find in my bathroom. I remember laying in my bed with her and holding her because that's what she asked for, and I didn't know what else to do. Eventually, an ambulance came and took her to the hospital, and my dad and I followed close behind. I stayed with her as much as I could. It's now been 4 years since that all happened. We've fallen out since then, but last I heard she's doing much better. I miss her all the time. I'm in my late 30s now, but back in the 90s I lived a chaotic life. My mom and stepdad were abusive. One day I got a tape stuck in the VCR and tripped out. My mom came home and kept threatening me. I was scared. I thought this is going to be bad. Then she said she was going to have my stepdad beat up my boyfriend as my punishment. I panicked because he was walking over to see me. Instead I ran out to meet him in a field. I told him I was running away. This was the first time he became rough with me. I was newly 15 and he was 19 and homeless. He and I were on the run for 2 weeks. It was difficult sleeping in the desert, hitchhiking, once becoming dehydrated. That one of the people we got picked up by gave me the soda he was drinking. This guy took me to a big city and wanted to pimp me off for money, but instead I talked him into letting me call my shio. I went home and he went back to our town to continue being homeless, jumping from couch to couch. I ended up marrying him at 16. I went from an abusive parent to abusive husband. He tried killing me when he thought I was trying to leave him. That's what gave me the courage to go. I was 19 with 2 kids, no education and no support. I'm glad I survived. I built my life up and broke the circle of domestic violence. I suffered another tragedy last year that has broken my heart, but I'm still trying to make a difference in this world and live a positive life. Looking back, this could have very much ended way worse than it had. So this was about a decade ago. I had to be about 5 at the time, and so brother was around 8. It was the middle of the night and we were relaxing just watching some kids next door in our room. Apparently my brother was inspired and got an idea to rule the world, so he decided we should go to the airport, steal a helicopter, and rule the world. He drew a fake map, and we set off out the house. Alarm was off this night for some reason. If I remember correctly, we walked a few miles in like half an hour. Meanwhile my mom's still asleep at the house. So far we see few cars and no one out on the street, but eventually we stumble upon a house with a man sitting out front. The man calls us over and asks us where our parents are and what their number is. Luckily, this was a man no morals, so he called our mom and waited outside with us. Though my mom was pretty freaked out when a random guy called her in the middle of the night telling her he had her kids XD. But eventually her and my dad rushed to pick us up, thanking the guy, and took us home. My brother got in a lot of trouble, but I didn't due to the fact that I wasn't as aware of the danger. Nonetheless, we were very fortunate that night because there were many worse scenarios that easily could have come true. I can't describe how much I appreciate that man, and whenever I have given up on humanity, which is often nowadays, I think back to him for reassurance. When I was 13 I ran away to my grandmother's place. I was fed up with my dad's drinking. He would drink often when my mom was at work and she didn't know about it. As far as I know, I didn't feel comfortable around my dad when he was drinking. He's an alcoholic. We did not have alcohol in the house growing up. I was taught that drinking equals bad behavior with negative consequences, like getting sent away to detox. It took me a long time to have a healthy view on alcohol. So anyway, I got tired of seeing my dad drink while my mom was working. The expectation was that I had to keep his secret. I wasn't allowed to tell, but my mom expected me to tell her if my dad was drinking behind her back. Who was I supposed to listen to? They had me in the middle of their issues. My grandmother let me stay the night. She called my dad and told him off. I'm sure my mom found out about it, but I don't remember us talking about it. I had to go back home and deal with the same shit for a few more years. I strongly considered running far away when I was 16 over 17, but I didn't. I love my parents, but being caught between their marriage issues kind of faked me up. I've ran away twice, once on my brother's 6th birthday, and once after school one day. The first time I'd fallen out with my mother over something, and we were arguing, and it got to the point where she was starting to get abusive, so I kinda pushed her out of the way, and ran to the nearest main road where I called my dad to pick me up. My parents separated years ago, because my mother was abusive. The second time I was at my grandparents' house, and my grandfather and I started arguing over batteries I think, and he started getting abusive. Notice a pattern? Like father like daughter, and he hid all the phones, and locked the door and things. I had my phone with me, but it was almost dead, so I started continuously phoning my dad and stepmom who both didn't answer, because they were at work, and when neither of them picked up the phone I called the police. When they answered my grandfather snatched my phone off me, and said everything's fine and hung up. The police then tracked my phone down to who's paying for it, my dad. At this point my mother turned up at my grandparents' house, and my grandfather held me back, while my mother came in, and they locked the door behind her, so I was still trapped. They both decided to leave me alone, as long as I calmed down, so I agreed, and once they left the room I grabbed my grandma's keys which she had left on the counter, and ran to my friend's house who comforted me, while my friend's mom and dad got in touch with my dad. Also I just remembered as I was running to my friend's house my grandfather's car pulled off the drive, so I had to literally run so fast to get around the corner. Rip me. TLDR, ran away twice, once when my mother and I fell out and once when my grandfather was pretty much holding me hostage and I managed to escape. Things were not great financially for us when I was 15 to 16 and our family had to move into an actual trailer park. There were drugs and crime going on everywhere around us, at all times of the night. I heard and saw abuse in everyone's house, all my friends. I just hated it so much. My sister thought she was little gangster girl, and hung out with petty criminals, brought them home, went to stupid parties, where they got drunk and high. She was only 17 at the time. I wasn't really into all that, but once she convinced me to go to a party, where I met a guy. He had just gotten suspended from school after getting into a fight and had a week off to do nothing since his parents didn't give a shit whether he was in school or not. We decided to run away, except does it really count if no one cares, and drive to the next state. We mostly spent our time at gas stations getting snacks, one night at a nasty motel, and talked to some really nice cops who for some reason didn't arrest us or shake us down. We lied and said we were 18, about to start college, and taking a vacation together, so maybe they believed us, maybe not. But they just told us to get home safely, be kind to each other, study what you want, make the most out of college. Shooting the breeze with us, really. I started feeling homesick, and asked if we could just back home and he agreed. We ended up just being friends after that and drifting apart. Our family got out of the situation and moved to a nicer area, and luckily for me, I did go to college. Last I found on Instagram, that boy I ran away with has been in and out of jail, acting a fool still, doing drugs, has 2 children. I knew it would happen that way. When we knew each other, I knew he had anger problems and depression and alcohol problems, but he was still sweet at heart and nice to me, which I thought was weird because he was this tough guy, and I was my sister's quiet little sister. I still remember him frozen in that moment as a teenager, not the skinny cracked out guy he is today. It's weird to see him that way actually. IDK if it really counts as running away, but it was a day that completely changed my life, and technically I did leave home without my parents' permission and didn't go back home again, so I guess it counts. Me, my sister, my mom and my mom's friend had tried to go out for the day. I didn't particularly want to go, and I pretty much knew it was gonna end in my mom doing something stupid. She was abusive all throughout my childhood up until the point that I left, which was this fateful day. Either way, she freaked the fuck out cause we are late for whatever tour we were supposed to be going on and absolutely flipped her shit in the streets of Glasgow. Somehow we got back home. I never really considered that place my home. Home was always with my dad. but that was after a horrifying 45-minute drive that had me and my sister sobbing and shaking in the backseat of our mom's car, fearing for our lives cause our mom had threatened to drive the car off the road and kill herself, taking us with her. To this day I still don't know how the fact we didn't die that day, because I know 100% my mom would have cold driven off that road. I remember falling asleep when I got back. I was asleep for maybe 5 minutes before my mom burst into my room absolutely screaming. After that she said that she'd be 20 minutes and that she was going to the shop. That's when I snapped. I text my dad telling him to come pick me and my sister up. I got my sister to pack anything we would need when I got a call from my mom. I answered, but she just yelled at me, so I hung up. My dad hadn't texted back yet and I was panicking. I text my now stepbrother asking him if he was home. He wasn't. This kid sprinted back home for us and made sure my dad knew we needed him. After I text my brother, I called my dad, which he answered thankfully, so my brother sprinting home wasn't necessary, but I'm still grateful for it to this day. My dad and my now stepmom were on their way and my mom was still trying to call me. This was when me and my sister left. We took all our important stuff and faking ran. I remember we heard someone skid in their car or something, and in retrospect it was probably just some drunk driver or something, but at the time me and my sister absolutely shit ourselves thinking it was our mom. We ran faster. We had agreed to meet our dad at a shop close to our house that we knew our mom wouldn't be at. She never went to this shop, like literally never. Me and my sister waited about 10 minutes behind a fence near the shop just in case for whatever reason our mom was there. She wasn't. Our dad arrived and we faking bolted to that car. I sighed the biggest sigh of relief I'd ever breathed the moment I got in that car, because I knew I was safe there. Things were dealt with after that, and I've never had to go back to that house or even be in the presence of my mom since. There have been a few encounters but nothing too major. I was 13 when this happened, and now I'm almost 15 living with my dad, sister and my amazing stepmom and brother. Plus our dumb as fuck dogs. I'm still adjusting to living like a semi-normal person, but I'm doing so much better than I was back then. Okay, this one's more wholesome. I've seen too many abusive parents for one night. My parents were awesome. They went out with my sisters and left me in charge of the house, mainly because I had no interest in girls softball. I was playing some video games when all of a sudden I realize how late it's getting. So I get worried. At this point, my imagination ran wild. I took my older sister's brand new softball bat, my fedora. I was pretty tall for 11, almost 5'7". I thought it would mask my baby face and make people think I'm an adult, and you know nobody gonna mess with an adult. And headed out to look for them. I was trying not to sob. I was scared and paranoid. I got down to my local park, where they had the games. I scoured the whole place, but it was in vain. I couldn't find them. I went home, sobbing, hoping for a miracle. When I was about to enter my street, a police car came. Me, I don't want any trouble. In my infinite wisdom, are you my name? Oh, yes, that would be me. You got everyone worried. They're looking for ya. He proceeded to ask me a bunch of questions. He comforted me and got me to my parents. I ran to my mom at light speed, my hat falling off my head. I gave her the biggest hug. Turns out they came home as soon as I left. Just my luck. TL. Doctor, I went on a wild goose chase and got caught by the police to find my parents who were at home. Edit. They didn't leave me home alone. They left me with my sleeping grandparents. I was safe. Maybe not as intense as other people, but when I was 14, my dad and I got in a screaming match to end all screaming matches. My dad and I fought almost every day during my childhood. I wasn't easy to deal with. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, and a then undiagnosed NVLD make for a nasty combination, and my dad didn't have the patience for it. My mom would try to intervene, but once he and I were red-faced with my voice breaking, she knew it was a lost cause. In this instance, I'd had a really shitty day at school and just wanted to be left the fuck alone. He decided me skipping dinner to continue decompressing wasn't acceptable and just about dragged me down the stairs. We stood in the hall yelling at each other for a solid few minutes before I just decided to say fuck it and run out the door. I walked a mile to the local park where I just sat on a swing and cried for I don't even know how long. Something in me broke that night. I was just so sick of being my dad's verbal punching bag and so sick of always feeling on edge. I couldn't bring myself to come home, even though I had no jacket or shoes, so I just holed up in the park for the night. The bathrooms were unlocked, so I just layered one of the seats with toilet paper and paper towels, squatted on it, curled up against the partition, and slept there. I walked back home in the really early morning to find my mom thoroughly freaked out. It was pretty normal for me to take a walk to escape the argument, but I'd never been out the whole night. My mom had stayed up the entire night, terrified I might have tried to kill myself somewhere. She was prepared to call the cops if I hadn't shown up when I did. It was the closest I'd ever seen my parents to divorcing, and it was the last time for a very long while my dad and I fought to such an extent, even he was scared he might have pushed too far. I still slightly regret that I didn't run further or stay out longer. It might have maybe helped my father see that I'm a person, not a way to offload his frustration and anger. Our relationship has steadily improved, but there are still moments when it's abundantly clear he doesn't respect me. My story might only half fit here, I'm not sure. My mother was always difficult, but she had done a great job at making me her counselor, her best friend and her punching bag, physically and emotionally. After my father left her, everything escalated. There was not a single day when she wouldn't scream at me or chase me through the house if I didn't comply to whatever headcanon she assumed was obvious this time. At 15, I ran away to my boyfriend. She knew about this, so I don't know if it counts, but I cut ties with her during that time. The boyfriend was abusive, and, since I had nowhere to go, I lived like that for 8 months before I finally couldn't take it anymore. I ran to a new guy. Yes, I know, shut up. It's complicated and I'm just not including the backstory of how that came to be to keep the post shorter. He was abusive too. I went to the mental hospital with my mother's help and after that return home. The beatings had stopped, but not the rest. At age 17, I moved to Vienna pretty much overnight. She was aware of this one too, since it was to go to an evening school there. I cut my ties for good a year ago, after everything got bad and worse, and I'm only at the beginning of processing the things she did to me. She always said me running away at 15 was an act of puberty and defiance, but it wasn't. I just couldn't take any more screaming and hitting. She threw a knife at me once and barely missed. Not much, but blood did happen. That is just one example of how far she would take it. I was 15, and not under the impression of being ready to live on my own, or with a boyfriend for that matter. The fact that I chose that over my supposed home should probably be enough info to see that things weren't okay with her. I was around 13 over 14. I remember I had a lot of arguments with my mom about school because I hated going there of kids who were bullying me non-stop. And my mom didn't understand that. She said that she doesn't care, she only cares that I get good grades and go to school. So in the same evening, when I had this argument with her, I said to her a lot of bad things like I hate you, I wanna die. And then I said to her I will move out. I don't care where I will go, but anywhere else is gonna be better than here. And so I did. I took my school backpack, packed some clothes and some snacks, and I went outside. But it was really cold outside, as in from Latvia winters can be really freezing. And after I left the house I just went to the wood storage building what we owned, and I was just sitting there inside for maximum 2/3 hours. And in that time I was just waiting for my mom to come and pick me up because I was freezing to death. But at the end I just went back home and went to sleep. But I realized that there was no point to leave home as my mom didn't understand the situation, what I had in school. So for the next 3/4 years I was most of the time at home and not at school. But my mom still don't know it till this day. I ran away 3 times. First time, my mom kidnapped us in Florida after saying we'd go back home after summer break. She has custody over us but me and my brother lived with our dad for most of our lives because my mom couldn't financially support us and preferred to travel using our child support money. I hated Florida. We stayed until December, and under false pretenses, my mom said we'd go back home to our dad. She cussed me out an hour later for packing too heavy, but I had no intention of coming back. Then she revoked the trip completely. Out of anger, I walked out the front door with my school uniform and some flip-flops. I didn't know where to go, so I eventually returned after a few hours. I was 12 around this time. The second time was my dad would constantly scream at me for no reason. This was around the time we returned home after my family had bought us tickets to return. He would drive me nuts. He'd come home from work angry at us. He always found something to complain about, like we left dishes in the sink, or left something in the middle of the floor. Most of the time, it was over jack sheet. He'd use his job as an excuse to verbally attack us. My brother didn't understand why dad was so angry with him, and I told him that once dad leaves for work, it was Christmas break, so we didn't have to worry about school. We were leaving. I packed my bag and all the money I had, which was like $70, and I was about to leave. But then my brother decided not to leave. My dad was always super manipulative towards him, since he was younger. He'd buy him his box card, or like a poster, and start crying if my brother didn't want his empty apologies. But this time, my brother forgave him. I wasn't as naive though. I left kinda late at night, and it was freezing, and my stomach was growling, because I was going on a hunger strike. I didn't want anything my dad gave to me. My dad came home a few minutes later, and saw I was missing, and my brother snitched on me. I called him a dog later. My titty and mom found me after my dad called them, and told them what happened. I spent the rest of my break at my grandma's. Third time was because my dad vowed not to scream at us, but he resorted to hitting me. I remember I got checked in the back of my head because I wanted to open up my high school acceptance letter myself. He was lying and said it was for the parental. Then I called him out on it. He threw the letter at me and then pop. My mom was present and she practically jumped on him. Then he told me that if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be getting that letter in the first place. That was the last time he hit me, probably because my mom told her family about it. Unrelated, but sort of, I remember a few years ago before my first run, my pop was in the hospital and my dad would come into the waiting room where me and my cousins would be playing or watching TV until it was time to leave. He'd see me playing and dancing around, and he'd just hit me. Sometimes were harder than others. My cousins would always see it, and told my titty, who told my uncle, mom, pop, and grandma, and I wasn't allowed to see him for a while. He'd slip money through the mail slot at my mom's house, and would blow up my phone. But back to my third run, I couldn't handle it anymore after the letter thing, and ran away, while he was asleep, with nothing besides the clothes on my back. I actually wanted to die at that point. It was slushy outside, and I was purposely walking in the street in hopes a car would swerve and hit me. My mom was beating the crap out of me when I was 9. It was the first time I stood up to her, and I screamed at her that I hated her. She dragged me to the door by my hair and threw me out onto the lawn screaming that I could get the hell out if I hated her, because she hated me too. It was raining and cold and I was wearing a t-shirt. I remembered that when I was 6, my stepdad had done this thing a bunch of times where he stopped in a Walmart parking lot and told me to get out and go away, and he wouldn't stop me. See, I didn't live with my mom and stepdad until I was 6. Before then I lived with my grandmother. I kept crying and asking to go home, and that pissed him off. So he kept taunting me and telling me to run away, saying he wouldn't miss me. And I'd been too afraid to do it then, and everything in my house had gotten so much worse over the years since then. When my mom threw me on the lawn and told me to leave, I just had this moment where I was like, this is my chance. I have to leave, because I didn't back then and everything keeps getting worse. So I got up and started walking, and I felt so at peace and so free, and I didn't know where I was walking, and I didn't care. But my mom caught up to me not even half a mile later, and everything did keep getting worse until eventually I was removed from the house and went back to live with my grandmother, but that didn't happen for several more years. I'm not sure if my story really counts. I was 19 years old, going on 20, so I was old enough to legally be responsible for myself. However, my dad and grandmother had omitted to teach me a lot of basic skills with the intention of keeping me dependent on them. I think they were hoping that I'd look after them in their old age. I had to be worth something, right? My mother hadn't been in the picture since I was 7, when my dad won full custody of me. She had kidnapped me from him for a year and a half, and in that time frame I was horribly abused and neglected by her and her friends. At first, when my dad got custody, things were amazing. He was pretty shy and unsure of himself. I think he found the idea of being a single dad to an abused daughter pretty daunting. Over the years he became more and more aggressive, and the verbal abuse increased. He would call me names, mock me, berate me, and blame every little mishap on me. I was a really good kid growing up, and didn't want to cause any trouble, so it's not like I gave him any reason to target me like that. Truth is, he didn't want kids. He took responsibility for me because it was the right thing to do, and his increasingly abusive behavior stemmed from a growing resentment and regret. My grandmother was extremely critical of me in every way imaginable. She would change her opinions and beliefs just so she could oppose me and declare herself to be in the right and me to be in the wrong. As I got older and started being my own person, she'd have tantrums and stomp her feet whenever she didn't get her own way or couldn't coerce me to do whatever it was she wanted. She used every chance she could to put me down, and I honestly believe she hurt me more than the brutal sheet my mother put me through. My grandmother was a huge influence towards my OCD, anorexia, and social anxiety. I had often approached them about how they talked to me, but they were of the attitude that, because they were adults, and my familial elders, they could do as they pleased. They didn't see any issues with the way they treated me, and would use my mother's abuse to guilt me. Are you trying to compare us to what your mother did? I had a heap of mental health issues, and I couldn't trust them enough to tell them about it. While in my late preteen and early teenage years, I had horrible hallucinations of seeing dead people in mirrors. I never told anyone, because what I was seeing was nowhere near as terrifying as what they would have done to me. If they had found out, they would have used it to keep me chained to them for the rest of their lives. They loved to use whatever they could to invalidate my opinions. You don't really want to leave the family, it's just your teenage hormones talking. They would have used the same sheet with my mental health. Initially I wasn't going to go to university, but I had a plan to move to Canada. Always had a strong pull to the country and kill myself there. I wanted to die somewhere I felt like I might actually belong, and somewhere beautiful. I realized that a degree would help my chances of moving there, and I figured it would help get me away from my relatives for a while. I even lied to them and said that my university required that I live on campus for the first year. Not even a month after moving to my student flat, my dad and I got into an argument and I ended up calling him out for all the shit they put me through. He refused to acknowledge any of it and instead started to act like I had attacked him for being a bad father. Should be noted, I never actually called him that. He jumped to that conclusion when I mentioned him calling me names and shouting at me for things that were nothing to do with me. He suggested we go our separate ways, and I didn't respond because he didn't deserve the closure. I did end up moving back to my hometown and having to commute to university in my second and third year. My hometown is small, so it was a miracle I never bumped into them, though there were way too many near misses for my liking. Not long after I graduated, my partner, who stuck through me through all of this, and I moved several hours away from my hometown, and since then we've been building our lives together. It's been 5 years this month since I ran away, and I have a house, a full-time job working in a well-known healthcare organization, and I get to wake up every morning to a man who truly loves me. I never intentionally ran away in this, but I could still count in my eyes. I was in about first grade maybe, and my mom was at work. My mother's boyfriend, now my stepfather, was at home watching me though. We lived in a big apartment complex, which had 2 parks. I lived next to the small one, and the big one was about a 2-minute walk away. I asked my mom's boyfriend if I could go to the big playground, and he let me, giving me 20 minutes to be there. I thought that was enough time, being in first grade and all, not really grasping the concept of time yet. So off I went with my old little toddler scooter to the big park. I was there for probably about 10 minutes maybe, when a little girl and her older brother had came up the park. I had met them once, before in the past at the small park next to our apartment, so I was happy to play with them. They got bored outside quickly though, and ended up inviting me inside their apartment, so away we go. I left my scooter outside of their door, in the hall of the complex. The apartment was bigger than mine, so when I went into the girl's room to play with her, I was amazed by the amount of space there was in the room. 2 hours passed, accordingly. Police were called by my mom's boyfriend, along with my mom, dad, and mother's family. I was still happily playing with the baby dolls with the girl. I went into their living room to get a drink of water when the mom and the brother pointed out that there were helicopters circling our apartment complex. I thought it was interesting, but didn't know what it was for exactly. Maybe there's a lost kid, said the mom, but I walked away to play with the girl again. Not long after, there was a knock on the door to the apartment. The mother answered, and I peeked out of the room and down the hall to see who it was. I was a curious child. My mother's boyfriend stood with my scooter, a policeman at his side. They were talking to the mother about how a girl, me, was apparently missing, and that the scooter was found at this apartment. The mother explained how Topsy thought I was allowed in here, because the kids invited me in, while I'm still pretty young to be out alone. I was taken home in the back of the police car. Outside of my apartment, my mother stood with her family crying. I got out of the car and she came up to me, hugging me and also yelling at me for my mistakes. I was lectured by my family and the police, but in the end most of the people were understanding of why I didn't know it was okay to 1 be out so long, 2 walking into a stranger's home, and 3 that 2 hours isn't 20 minutes. The police even gave me a bear. For some reason, I was also grounded from going outside alone until I was in 4th grade. I didn't have a bad household, and even now I'm not growing up with horrible or abusive parents. I love my parents, and I hope they love me. This was just a bad mistake I made as a kid. But I still like to start out this story when I retell it that I ran away when I was about 7. Also, you can't blame a 7-year-old for not knowing how long 20 minutes really is, can you? I lived with mom. My mom was never perfect and either was my dad. At one point my mom's drug abuse was too much. My little brother and sister went to live with their dad and me, mine. I was 14. Sucked because I missed my brother and sister who were in another town. I had basically been taking care of them, like I was their mother. In some ways, was great because I was living more like a normal kid. Well, long story short, I decided I needed to be with my mom and took off. Totally different neighborhood and basically became us living on the streets. Sometimes together, sometimes apart. Not always safe situations. I ended up at a friend of my mom's. She was basically my mom before she lost her kids. So I helped her oldest son take care of her other kids. We became a couple. It was like playing house but real. Until went on a trip with his grandpa. I realized I was pregnant and I got in an argument with his mom and left. I was 15 by this point. I literally slept outside a few times that time around. Wasn't good. Knew I had to change. Before this, I had some idea of being free. I also loved my boyfriend and felt I was keeping some sort of loyalty to my mom. Being pregnant meant I had someone else to think about. So I went to my aunt's. She called my dad. I was scared to call him myself. He came to get me. He wasn't pleased with the situation, but I was safe with him. He cold being like, oh sure, now that you need my help. He never acted like that though. All was forgiven, and we moved on from there. My boyfriend lived with us too. For about 3 years, till we broke up. Every time I think about my runaway story, I think about what I must have put my dad through, and how he didn't hold it against me. My aunt and cousin told me about him crying, but he never told me himself. My dad put up with a lot, and was super supportive when I needed him. I don't know if I can consider this running away, but here it goes. So I have been living with my mum in London with her new BF, and he was physically abusing, so I decided to stay at my dad's house when I got the opportunity to live in France again when I went to holidays. I told the story to my dad, and he decided to keep me. For personal reasons I had to go back to my mom's house, but my stepdad was still abusive physically but mentally too now. During secondary I was able to deal with it as I was of my time at school, and then I'd go and play football, soccer, but whilst I got to college, when I was 16 during my first year I started to feel suicidal and depressed for various reasons of my past which started to creep on me and due to him. I never really talked about it with anyone, so I started to miss school a lot. So one day I had to come clean to my school, who was asking why I was missing school so much. So I told the truth. They sent me to hospital, and I was diagnosed with depression and my stepdad said I was faking it to get attention. In October 2018, when I was already 17, I had went to a family friend to get my hair done, a haircut, and ended up getting my hair dyed, and he didn't like that, so he didn't let me go to school for 2 days, and I had enough of it, so I decided to tell my school, because my sister-in-law from his side told me I had to leave, and so was my friends who I was telling what was happening to me, as he knew my whole life story, and that family friend who does my hair who I currently live with. When I told my school, they arranged a way for me to live with my aunt, my family friend. Since November 2018 I've been living there, and that's how I ran away. Was 17 and dating this girl my mom didn't like. Her sister was hanging around with these illegals who had just moved and who were selling drugs, gangbanging, etc. It was known throughout the teenagers in the project that old girl was getting passed around at parties with these older drug dealers. She was 16. Well, my sister, 13, started hanging out with my GF's sister, and thus started hanging out with the gangbangers. I told my mom about it, and told her I wouldn't have my sister hanging out being a coco to a bunch of illegal gangbangers. Well, see, my mom was friends with the Abula, and was basically facilitating this whole illegal immigration into the project with this lady. Whole thing. Stolen SSNs, fake IDs, the whole thing, and that didn't go well with her. I didn't raise a racist. Then she kneed me in the balls. Not the first time. She'd been making a habit of it the last couple of months anytime I pissed her off. Mind you, this was in the project. There were only like 3 or 4 white families in the whole hood. The majority of my friends were black. The majority of my girlfriends had been black. Yeah, I'm a real racist mom. Anyway, I just bounced. Stayed the night in a woods nearby where I knew I wouldn't get faked with, and went to a bud's house and crashed his couch for a couple days until I found a girl who would let me stay with her if I essentially became her sex toy / manservant. Which meant I crashed on a couch and cleaned her house and took care of her kids and faked her disgusting fat as when she wanted. It was not a good time to be alive.